Hey guys, my name is Don Patterson, and I'm a computer science professor at Westmont College. And today I want to give a short lecture that I've titled A Tale of Two Surveillance Cultures. This is a story about how ideas that we have about who we are as a culture can combine with technology to create a trajectory of cultures that are different, even though the technology is the same. And I think that a lot of times people that work in technology think that technology is neutral. But technology exists in a social context, and depending on what that social context is, the technology will have different kinds of effects. And that's what I want to talk about in this lecture. I had the great opportunity around 1993, 1994 to work with a professor named Dan Huttenlocher. He is still an active computer science professor. He works out of Cornell, New York City now. At the time, we were at Cornell in Ithaca, New York. At this point, in around mid-90s, the internet was a very unknown network. Computers existed, personal computers existed in business environments, and sometimes those offices were connected within a network that was within their office. But rarely did computers connect to networks outside of the office in which they were in. Cornell was an exception. We had some labs that were connected to other research centers throughout the world that were exploring what you could do with this new thing called the internet. And as I was working there, I discovered this thing that was just amazing at the time. It was a program called X-Coffee. And X-Coffee was a little window that would pop up, and it would show you a webcam view of a lounge in Cambridge, England, where university researchers there had trained a camera onto a coffee pot. Why would they do that? Well, the reason why they did it is because they wanted to save effort. They didn't want to get up out of their chair to go down and get a cup of coffee if the coffee pot was empty. So they set up a web camera so they would never have to do that. This seems trivial, but in many ways, this was the first webcam that ever existed. It was 128 by 128 pixels in black and white. But the thing that was amazing about it at the time is that this was the first time that anyone had really taken the opportunity to broadcast not even video, but rapidly updated still images across the internet. And in the American context, that means that now someone could compete with the likes of ABC, NBC, or CBS, the major television broadcasters at the time. The possibilities that were opened up here were amazing. There was nothing like this that was available at the same time. Now, if you move forward to the present day, looking and trying to find coffee is a really different enterprise. And in fact, if you use the Starbucks app, like this screenshot on my iPhone that I took the other day, I used the screen name Don Quixote, you can see that not just looking for coffee, but actually ordering coffee can be done through the internet. And not only are you ordering coffee when you use the Starbucks app, but you're participating in a whole ecosystem of services that they want you to interact with, whether it's music that they're suggesting that you listen to, inspired by their coffee shop, whether it's a reward system where you get discounts on future coffee depending on what you buy, or an inbox where they can communicate with you. Notably, all of this interaction is being done over the internet. Not shocking, but consider the difference between 1991 and 2019. 1991, we looked at a coffee pot through the internet and thought that was amazing. In 2019, doing anything that doesn't require the internet seems strange. Why would you if you can connect through the internet and do it much faster and much more efficiently? Well, this change from the X-Coffee of 1991 to the app of 2019 is a pretty drastic change in the way that transactions and interaction and communication happens. And in fact, if you think about it now, the majority of interpersonal communication is computer mediated. Let's think about three different media that might apply to. So like, for example, audio conversations. Audio conversations maybe had a trajectory that you could imagine that was something like this. We started with face-to-face communication, and that was unmediated, meaning I would have a conversation with someone and there'd be no one in between. But then, as time moved on and technology advanced, we started to have technological mediation in our communication. So there was a phone between me and you when we communicated, and maybe there was actually a human operator that was connecting wires so that we could make a long-distance call. Now, eventually, we were able to automate away some of that circuit switching, and we started putting computers in between to automate that work. And so now, if we make a phone call using voice over IP technology, the computer is routing the same audio over the internet that our coffee orders are using from our Starbucks app. A computer is between us when we have audio conversations. What about text conversations? Similar kind of history. Started with maybe a Pony Express or a courier carrying letters between two people. Human mediation if we weren't in the same place. It doesn't make much sense to write a note to someone you're next to, so it probably started as human mediation. But very quickly, with the advent of the telegraph, we had the ability to do wireless and wired technologically mediated communication. This little notebook screenshot here is a log entry from the first communication that was done using TCP/IP, using the very earliest stages of the internet. And this was a point at which the technological mediation of a telegraph shifted over to being a computer-mediated communication. So now email is coming between me and you if I want to send a text. And that email is all run by computers. It's collecting, it's authoring, it's presenting, it's also routing that email from one person to another. And the same with text messaging. I text you, there's a lot of computers that are in between on the way. Finally, with video conversation, face-to-face, there's no video, so it's just unmediated. Then at some point we had broadcast television. That moment that the X-Coffee application really disrupted, when the only way to have a video conversation was through a broadcast network, still technologically mediated with television. But now if we have a group chat over Skype in some way, it's a computer-mediated conversation. So computers are controlling the pipeline between two people who are communicating. There are a lot of pros of this. For example, if you start to type an email in Gmail, you can get automated completion of your messages. That's the computer that's between you and me, helping me to write a better message or helping me to do it faster. You can have fun filters. So for example, if I want to have a video chat with you over an iPhone, I can use the Animoji feature and do a motion capture of my face and have the phone lay that on top of some kind of character like this unicorn here. So that as I communicate with you over video, the computer is intercepting that communication and changing it. We also have automated computer assistants like Siri that will help us send a text message, help us mediate that communication. Computers are helping to change that pipeline, but they're also hurting. We have spam emails that arrive all the time. There are fake videos that are messing up those video conversations. There are deceptive robocalls and text messages that aren't coming from people. So having a computer mediating our communication, it helps in some ways, but it also offers some new problems in that mediation. Well, now the thing is it's not just our communication that's being mediated now. In fact, the majority of all transactions, our Starbucks app, the way we pay our utilities, the way we get our bus ticket, are all computer mediated. And not only are they computer mediated, but they're recorded. Every email, web search, video you've watched, place you've gone with your mobile phone, every non-cash purchase you've ever made, every news article you've ever read, every photo you've taken, where it was taken, every person you've interacted with at a distance, every ad you've responded to, every ad you've responded to, every phone call you've picked up, what you look like, what you sound like, what your political and religious beliefs are, your health data, your family relationships, your credit history, where you live, where you work, where you vacation, what you talk about with whom, who talks about you, what books you like, what movies you like, what food you like, your physical gait, your driving patterns, and your energy usage. All examples of things that are recorded. Pretty disturbing, pretty thought-provoking if you stop and think about all the data that's recorded about you in particular. So this requires some thinking, and this is where I want to bring up these big ideas about how cultures think about this data. And I want to talk about two particular ones. One is called the Panopticon, and another one that's called the capture model. I would say these are two pretty important ways in which academics talk about data collection, and from these ideas we get different sorts of conclusions about privacy and ethics about that collection. So let's start with the Panopticon. The Panopticon was a treatise written in 1787 by a guy named Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham, you can think of him like the U.S. Founding father, Benjamin Franklin, a little bit. He's kind of in the same category. Bentham is famous for being progressive, even by today's standards. He was an advocate of the philosophy of utilitarianism, and he spent a lot of time thinking about this idea of the Panopticon. What was it? Well, the Panopticon was a building. It was an architectural design that he thought would be appropriate for, as you can see on the screen here, for prisons or madhouses, maybe something we would more appropriately call psychological hospitals today, or schools. Apparently, the same architecture is good for all three of those. So Bentham put this idea together, And what it looked like is a circular building. Here's an aerial shot of a diagram that he made. You can see in the center there's a guard tower, and around the edge are a bunch of cells, the prison cells, separated by the red walls. It hasn't actually been built very many places, but here's an example of one place in which it has been built. And you can see that in this building, the guard tower's in the center and can see into all of the different prison cells. But the prison cells can't really see what's going on in the guard tower because of the small window. And they can't really see very much about what's going on with the other prison cells, at least the ones near them that aren't far away from them. So this was an interesting idea. Bentham talked about it a lot. It didn't really make much headway until the 1970s when a theorist, an academic theorist named Michel Foucault, started thinking about the Panopticon and using it as a metaphor for the way that we think about data collection in our society today. And in particular, what he looked at in the Panopticon was the way in which, when the guards looked out into the people in the cells couldn't see the guards. And so they felt as if they were being watched. And because they felt like they were being watched, Bentham theorized that they would behave better, that they would self-police themselves, that they would self-regulate, because they never knew if a guard was watching them and was about to punish them for negative behavior. Foucault saw this kind of dynamic and said, hey, actually this is kind of happening in our modern world. What in the world am I talking about? Well, have you ever walked into a big store, a big grocery store, or maybe a Walmart or a gas station, and seen a kind of display like this when you walked in? A display of a CCTV camera somewhere in the building. Well, what this is doing is it's showing to you as a customer walking into the building that you're on a closed-circuit TV camera, that you're on a security camera. And the intention of this sort of presentation is to suggest to you as the person entering into the store that you better behave. You better not shoplift, you better not vandalize, you better not do any other sort of negative behaviors that the store doesn't want because we're watching you. But like the Panopticon, in practice, you don't actually know whether you're being watched. You know there are cameras, but you don't know if anyone's watching that feed. And so as a result, you have the tendency to self-regulate yourself, to police your own behavior, regardless of whether or not there's actual authorities out there. So this idea is called the Panopticon. And I would say it's one of the dominant ways that gets talked about data collection in the public discourse in the United States. Well, if we think about that kind of a framing of data collection, then we have a particular way in which we think about the world. For starters, here are some of the consequences of that thought pattern. Data collection is about being watched, and so we're talking about a visual metaphor for the way in which the world is operating. Generally, the collecting of that data is bad for the people that are being surveilled. But the collection is non-disruptive. You don't have to intervene or to be part of that collection at all. You're just part of it, and it's happening. We generally, in the Panopticon, think of this data as being centralized, and we think about that as if there are files on you, maybe in the way that we talk about FBI files or Nazi Germany SS files, a dossier somewhere out there that people are collecting on you in order to identify the bad behaviors that you might be part of. Thinking about the world like the Panopticon is a territorial view. And so we think about the places where it's okay to have cameras and the places where it's not okay to have cameras. The places where we expect there to be surveillance and places where we don't expect there to be surveillance. We think about the world as maybe a shopping mall. Yeah, we expect there to be surveillance there and we kind of are okay with that. But a bathroom, we don't expect there to be surveillance in the bathroom, and basically we're not okay with that. And the way we think about that is in terms of physical territory. The implication of this is that we reorganize our movement in order to increase or decrease surveillance. We internalize that surveillance in the same way that people internalize the guards watching them in the original Panopticon. What does this mean? This means that maybe if you're taking a one-day holiday and you call into your work and you say that you're sick, and in fact you're going to an amusement park, going to Disneyland, you might actually ask the people that you're traveling with not to take pictures of you and post them on social media, because you don't want your image to be portrayed to your coworkers because you're being surveilled. You know you're being surveilled. Or maybe you'll turn off the ability to be tagged for that day. But you internalize that and you recognize you're being surveilled and you change your behavior as a result. Okay, so Panopticon, that's one way of thinking about the world. Another way of thinking about surveillance is the capture model. Now the capture model is much less sinister. The capture model helps us to understand things like this pizza tracker. If you use Domino's, at least in the US, I don't know how it works in other parts of the world, but if you use Domino's, you might have made a phone call, asked for Domino's to deliver a pizza, or done it online, and encountered this pizza tracker. Now, the pizza tracker, when you first see it, is kind of an amazing thing, because what it shows you is it shows you a progress bar that moves forward as your pizza is going through the process of being created and delivered to you. So it starts with the order being placed, and then the pizza being prepped, it being boxed, it being cooked and then being boxed, and then when it goes out for delivery. And if you were to sit there at the computer and watch the progress bar, you kind of have this disconcerting experience where as the progress bar fills up, there's a knock on your door or your doorbell rings and your pizza is there. So in order to actually produce this kind of a progress bar, well, data needs to be captured. The information you called in, and so you made a phone call, and so that phone call was recorded, and who you are is recorded, and your order is recorded, and your address is recorded, and then the different steps that your pizza goes through is recorded and surveilled. And at the end of the day, your pizza is delivered, and that whole experience has been recorded. But if we think about the pizza tracker, it certainly doesn't feel quite as sinister as the Panopticon. And so another example that you might have is you might have the example of going to a grocery store and getting a receipt. Now, this particular receipt for things that I bought has an enormous amount of data captured on it. Exactly what I bought, what was taxed, what wasn't taxed, what time I purchased the goods, what the location was of the store that I purchased the goods at, who the cashier was, what payment method I used, all kinds of information around this receipt. And yet, it doesn't feel like the government is watching me so much on a receipt. Instead, it feels like, oh, maybe the grocery store is using this kind of information in order to refill their inventory, to make a call to the delivery truck to make sure that there's more food and goods available on the store after someone purchases it. Or if we use a key card in order to get access into a building, we don't really think very much in terms of that being an observation of us. Instead, we think about that as, oh, it's an efficient way to do security, and we can change it really quickly, and we can change it remotely. So all of these things suggest a different way of thinking about data collection and surveillance, and this is the capture model. And the idea in the capture model is that businesses largely instrument the world in a way that they can produce grammars of action that they can then produce services on top of. So what do I mean when I say grammar of action? For example, in the Domino's case, there are different steps that fit together in something that's like a sentence. You order a pizza, the pizza's prepped, the pizza goes in the oven, the pizza's boxed, the pizza's delivered. These steps form a kind of sequence of things that need to be observed in the world in order to complete a delivery. And so businesses increasingly try and capture bits of data to make business processes, commercial processes, other kinds of processes visible to the computer so that they can provide better and more efficient services on top of it. This is the nature of the capture model. So if you frame the world in terms of the capture model, what you see is that data recording is about computational understanding. It's about trying to get the computer to understand the actions that are taking place in the world, trying to make meaning out of otherwise fragmented sensor data. Generally, we think about this collection as being good for the people that are surveilled. I want to know when my pizza is going to arrive. I want to know that it's making progress because I'm hungry. That data needs to be parsed, it needs to be synthesized, it needs to be reconstructed. That's part of the way we think about the capture model. It's not delivered to us, we have to construct it. But we also think about the data in this model as being distributed. We don't expect that Smart and Final, the grocery store, has access to the pizza delivery information. But the businesses are trying to correlate this data. We're trying to link your profile to Twitter, to connect your Starbucks account to your iTunes account, in order to try and create more visibility to the computational systems about the varied behaviors that you're in, so that we can put together sentences of actions that are being observed so that we can build services on top of them. So surveillance ends up getting piggybacked as a secondary effect of this attempt at trying to make meaningful sense of the world. It implies a reorganization of your behavior in order to increase efficiency and to further capture. You change the way you behave so that your legibility to the system is possible. You recognize that the environment is capturing data about you, and you want those grammars to be completed. So for example, if you have motion sensors in your environment that turn on the lights, you might change the way that you move in and out of an environment to make sure you go by that light switch so that you trigger the lights that come on and go off. Maybe you have a fancy thermostat like the Nest thermostat, and you want it to know that you're home so that it sets the temperature appropriately. Maybe you live in some kind of a gated community where as you go into your neighborhood, you need to wave a key card in order to open the gate. Well, now you change your car environment so the key card is nearby whenever you need it. So you're aware of the way in which the world is watching you and collecting grammars of you, and you change your behavior as a result. All right, so there are two different models, the Panopticon and the capture model. Now, noticeably, this is not about differences in technologies. These are differences about the way that we think about the data that's being collected. And depending on the way that we think about the data being collected, even with the same technology, we come to very different conclusions about what's happening in the world. So take, for example, this situation. This is a picture of a toll booth. On the right side, you see a fast track lane. A fast track is a certain kind of active RFID beacon that sits on your dashboard of your car so that when you drive under this arch, the arch queries the beacon with radio frequency energy, and the beacon responds back with the identification of the car, so that as you drive through this arch, you can have your toll deducted automatically from an account, and you don't have to stop and pay the toll in person like you do on the left-hand side. So the right-hand side, you drive right through because you have this technology, and the left-hand side, you stop and you pay with cash or credit card or whatever's possible. Now, if you think about this picture from the perspective of the Panopticon, maybe you freak out. You think, oh, great, here's just another limitation of my freedom. I'm unable to travel freely because the toll booth is keeping track of where I am at all times. And so anyone, the government, the police, knows exactly where I am. This limits my freedom. On the other hand, if you think about this from the capture model, you think, oh, well, I'm going to have to pay when I go through this toll booth. It would be really great if I could make my behavior visible to the system so that I can go faster. And as a matter of fact, it turns out that the toll you pay with Fast Track is cheaper than the toll that you pay in person to incentivize people to use the Fast Track system. And so if you think about it from the capture model, you're just trying to make your behavior visible so that you can have a more efficient route, a more effective, faster transition. Same technology, two different approaches to the world, two different senses of what's happening, regardless of whether or not the technology is the same in both cases. So this is about data collection. So from the Panopticon side, we have some pros. We have better and more robust security. We have improved safety. We can look at unsafe situations from afar. We have high quality forensic analysis. Like in the US after the Boston Marathon bombing, we were able to very quickly identify who perpetrated that terrorism event because of all the surveillance that was present in the city. People are less likely to believe they can get away with something. Pros of the capture model: better resource efficiency, lower priced consumer goods and services, very high quality information, for example, where your FedEx package is, where your pizza is. Just-in-time processes are possible. We don't need to load up the truck to refill the shelves in Walmart until we know the shelf in Walmart is empty. And more efficient management generally. On the other hand, there are some cons. So in the Panopticon's case, we have ideological and social freedom being suppressed. And honestly, I think that social diversity is one of our best sources of resilience that we have to face future crises. We lose our reasonable ability to control our self-presentation to others, because if we're constantly being viewed by the government and we never have any space when we're not being viewed, we're constantly having to portray an image of ourselves that is in line with what the authorities want. And we lose our ability for political dissent because we can't organize without being disrupted. In the capture model, we have intellectual and imaginative freedom being suppressed because we know that every physical action that we take speaks a kind of grammar that's being observed and triggers a cascade of digital events that communicates with other systems. So if you read a book on your Kindle, you're not just reading a book on your Kindle. You're being observed, which book you're reading, how fast you're reading it, what you highlight, how far you are in your book at any given time. Or if you choose to live in a particular place in the United States, more recently, that choice has an impact on what your SAT score is going to be. This is a recent development from the College Board. So you can't just move and run freely. There are consequences to the digital capture of your information. So when we add machine learning to this mix, we're talking about using this data and now creating predictive models about what is going to happen as a result of this data that's present generally. So if we think about this from the perspective of the capture model first, we get a certain kind of outcome. And so to understand this, let's go back in time to Google. Back in the day at Google, when Google was a very young company and all they had was a search engine and they were developing very innovative technology, they would present a search engine to the user and the user might type something in, for example, asking how much caffeine is a large drink at Starbucks. When the user entered this query, Google would present some results. Then the user would pick an answer. Now Google would record which answer that the user picked, because if they didn't pick the top answer, Google wanted to improve their algorithm. And so they would use the knowledge of what the most popular answer was in response to a query in order to change their algorithm so that the most widely selected entry appeared at the top. This is an example of surveillance of your search queries in an effort to improve your data, an effort to improve the search engine. So you can think about this as a cycle that's very user-centric. We do some data collection, we analyze it, we improve the search process, we monitor the interaction, data collection, analytics, search. We have an iterative loop that improves the search engine behavior as we go along. Then one day Google realized that by looking at some of the data, they had a lot of insight into other things that were going on in the world. This is a picture of flu trends in the United States. The dark blue line is data collected in 2009 and 2010. Now, the Center for Disease Control in the United States collects this information directly from physicians, comes from clinics, and gets dispersed to the CDC so that the Center for Disease Control can keep track of epidemiological outbreaks. And every year they produce information about the state of the flu in the United States. Now, the thing is the way that the CDC collects this information often has a lag of 2 to 3 weeks. Well, Google was able to generate some interesting information by paying attention to certain queries. For example, queries like, how do you take care of a fever? How do you cure a sore throat? By looking at how many of these queries were being issued by users, they were actually able to create flu trend maps like the one that's presented here that correlated very highly with the Centers for Disease Control, but was calculated in real time. So 2 or 3 weeks earlier, the data was coming in. This was a gold mine of information when suddenly it was realized that that data collection about queries wasn't just useful for improving the search process, but actually was useful for other things as well. Another example outside of Google where this happens is on Twitter. So this is a collection of tweets that had a particular hashtag that was #redshirt. This was collected in 2010, and the hashtag related to a protest, a kind of rebellion that was going on in Thailand called the Red Shirt Protest, Red Shirt Rebellion at the time. And I collected this data of the volume of tweets associated with that rebellion, and the stars indicate times when protesters were killed as part of that rebellion. And you can see that the volume of tweets that was coming out correlated highly with violent events that were happening at the same time. So this is another example of a side effect of data that being collected that could be useful for something other than the first use, which is to communicate information to one another. Another example is this. This is a collection of tweets that contain the word earthquake. And you can see that this is actually monitoring the tweets that say earthquake. But you can see that the actual pattern looks a lot like a seismograph that's measuring the actual earthquake itself. This is an earthquake in California. And so this suggests a certain kind of humorous way to react in an emergency. Update your Facebook status line, send a Twitter message, maybe use a phone camera to make a YouTube clip, or the least likely thing to actually do would be to call emergency services. This is a graph from Graph Jam online. Another humorous way to look at this is through a comic that XKCD put out. This comic, I'll read it for us. It says, when an earthquake hits, people flood the internet with posts about it, some within 20 or 30 seconds. Hey, Rob M163 here, earthquake! Damaging seismic waves travel at about 3 to 5 kilometers per second, and fiber signals travel at about 200,000 kilometers per second minus network lag. This means that when seismic waves reach about 100 kilometers out, they begin to be overtaken by waves of tweets about them. And so people outside the radius of that seismic effect may get word of the quake via Twitter, IRC, or SMS before the shaking starts. Here's a person saying, whoa, earthquake. And then the punchline is, sadly, a Twitterer's first instinct is not to find shelter. Hey, retweet Rob M163, huge earthquake here. What we can call this secondary use of information is behavioral surplus. And behavioral surplus can be defined as that it can be used as a way of generating profit. Behavioral surplus is human experience that can be used as a raw material and that then can be mined for profit. In the same way that a company might mine coal, rare earth metals, lithium, gold from the ground, companies can also mine value from human experience. This is a definition that comes from an author named Zuboff, who I will give a full reference to at the end of this slide deck. So now we have a secondary cycle, also coming inspired by Zuboff's analysis. That initial blue cycle is now augmented by a green cycle of machine learning, where we take that behavioral surplus, we apply machine learning to it, and create prediction products about what we think that people are going to do based on the information that we're collecting. This then enables us to create economic markets in future behavior of people, which is able to be leveraged to make money. That money can then get put back into the system to create new ways of collecting data about people that create new and more advanced behavioral surplus, machine learning, prediction products, markets and future behavior, etc. So this leads to the kind of effect that's referenced in this comic that says, I think my Nest smoke alarm is going off because Google AdWords just pitched me a fire extinguisher and an offer for temporary housing. So what I would call this kind of result is surveillance capitalism. This is when we do data collection, apply machine learning, and then say that human experience is a source of mining for profits. It comes from a world in which we think about the capture model as what's happening with data collection. On the other hand, if we think about the world as the Panopticon and we go through data collection and machine learning, we end up with a different kind of world. So for example, perhaps you've heard about China's experiment with rating everyone via a social score that's driven by kinds of behaviors that the Chinese government think are worthy of promoting. This is being tried. This is from a Washington Post article, and that article said that this project, launched in Jiangsu Province, Suning County in 2010, gave citizens performance points for good behavior, up to a maximum of 1,000. But a minor violation of traffic rules would cost someone 20 points, and running a red light, driving while drunk, or paying a bribe would cost 50. Some of the penalties show the Communist Party's desire to regulate its citizens' private lives, participating in anything deemed to be a cult, typically Falun Gong, or failing to care for elderly relatives incurred a 50-point penalty. Other penalties reflected the party's obsession with maintaining public order and crushing any challenge to its authority. Causing a disturbance that blocks party or government offices meant 50 points off, and using the internet to falsely accuse others resulted in a 100-point deduction. Winning a national honor, such as being classified as a model citizen or worker, added 100 points to someone's score. The kicker is this. On this basis, citizens were classified into 4 levels. Those given an A grade qualified for government support when starting a business and preferential treatment when applying to join the party, government, or army, or applying for a promotion. People with D grades were excluded from official support or employment. More recently, this has been used to limit people's travel, to limit their ability to get loans or bank services. And so, following this kind of panopticon model, you get this image of Tiananmen Square, highly surveilled. You have facial recognition, presumably being applied to that surveillance, in order to feed into this social credit score that has an impact for your ability to move and work and live as a result. Now, this sounds horribly totalitarian, and it is in many ways, but you have to remember that there's kind of a funny side to the whole thing, because this is still in a human context in a very large company that's difficult to control. So in a more recent Washington Post magazine, here's an example of a shopkeeper who is in the middle of one of these experiments for social grading. And you can see that his shop has been given a rating on this placard next to it. He has 5 different categories, and he's gotten 5 stars in each of those categories, which seems great, but if you look carefully at the stars that are present there, it turns out that he did not get 5 out of 5 in all 5 categories. In fact, many of those stars are just red star stickers that he purchased outside of the system and just stuck on his sign. So for all the fear of the social code, there's still very human aspects to this that are going to thwart it in different ways. Nevertheless, the result of taking these data collection and machine learning applications and technologies and applying it to a Panopticon kind of a model, you end up with something that looks like surveillance totalitarianism. Centralized government that bends the people to the will of the authorities, forcibly. Now, this is my main contribution that I want to offer today, is this kind of model about thinking about the world. Because the Panopticon and the capture model aren't completely exclusive, and surveillance totalitarianism and surveillance capitalism aren't completely different either. They're kind of two different sides of looking at the same technology. I do think it's interesting, though, that if you think about the United States, and the United States has a kind of a high cultural aversion to government surveillance generally, to authority, the police, the military being operating within its own country. And so as a result, we resist the Panopticon. And so in the US context, we're much less likely to move into a surveillance totalitarianism state, but we're very happy to move into a surveillance capitalism state. China's kind of the opposite. Stereotypically, they're thought of as being very afraid of a free market, afraid of companies and people organizing to discover their own information. And so they're much more concerned about the capture model. And so the likelihood of their country ending up in surveillance capitalism is far lower than ending up in surveillance totalitarianism. So it's almost like you cross over into the different outcome based on what data collection you're afraid of at the top. So what do we do about this? Well, the first thing to do is to think clearly, and that's why I've given this lecture today. Big ideas, big stories about what data collection is like, the Panopticon or the capture model, result in very different outcomes of a surveillance state at the bottom of that pyramid. And also recognize that it isn't all bad. Safety and security are good things, and efficiency in our business processes and our markets is also a good thing. But it's not all necessarily good either. We don't want to operate as if we're prey being digitally stalked. And so as a result, we need to pursue actively strong democratic controls over both government and business so that we have some real recourse and limits against authorities, corporate, government, or otherwise, that overstep bounds for a flourishing life of the citizens. The other thing to do is to think beyond yourself. Think about other people that are being affected and ways in which you can help them. You might be in a particular position of power where you're able to help vulnerable communities around you, and without your participation, that's not going to happen. That might be in the scope of governance, that might be in the scope of education, it could be in a lot of very high-level or detail-oriented ways. Immediately, you can think about non-participation by using encryption and obfuscation as strategies for avoiding some of this surveillance. So if you're interested in these ideas and you would like some further reading, I would recommend a few options. The first is a book called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff. Some of the ideas in my lecture are inspired by her work. It's a really interesting book, very recent. Another book called Obfuscation talks about ways of avoiding surveillance or throwing a monkey wrench in the gears of the surveillance machine, written a few years ago by Brunton and Nissenbaum. These are really good, accessible ideas about obfuscation and ways to think about it. And then the third recommendation for further thought is the app called Signal. Signal is a messaging app that enables you to communicate with other people, but it's highly encrypted and enables you to get outside of the communication space that's controlled by Google, Facebook, the telecom companies, and be sure that you're having a secure communication with people on the other end of your communication channel. Still computer mediated, but it's a pipeline that you can have a lot of confidence in. All right. Thank you very much for your attention and listening to this lecture. I hope it was valuable. I'd love to see any comments that you have for me. You can tweet them out to me at @DJP3 or leave them in any comments below where this video ends up, presumably YouTube, but we'll see. Thank you very much.